My name is Anthony, and I'm refuting Melissa's claim that the flu vaccine fails to effectively prevent the flu. She gives some background on the subject, stating that most vaccines today are made by injecting fertilized hen eggs. It's incubated, harvested, extracted, and inactivated and purified, and then put into a vaccine. Her secondary claims were: 1, virus can mutate; 2, the vaccine contains harmful substances; and 3, repetitive vaccinations results in more ineffective vaccines. In response to secondary claim 1, that the virus can mutate, she quotes Dr. Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, that states, virus has the ability to change rapidly as it circulates. She also has Dr. Bologna from the Marshall Clinic Research Institute that states, while growing the virus for vaccines, the H3N2, which is the current strain, mutates to adapt to the eggs, which seems to result in a vaccine mismatch. The two sources she uses for this claim are focused on the H3N2 strain, which in the same article from CNN where she quotes Dr. Gottlieb, they say, according to the CDC, the H3N2 strain is only 69% in the virus accumulation this year. The other 31% of the virus accumulation hasn't been included in the argument. Leaving out almost a third of the virus count doesn't show a solid argument for the generalization she wants to prove. The secondary claim also focuses on only egg-based vaccines. In an article by the CDC, they say at this point there are 3 ways to produce vaccines: egg-based, cell-based, which uses mammalian cells instead of eggs, and recombinant, which uses the protein from the immune response of smaller viruses combined with the flu virus. While most of the vaccine production is egg-based, there are ever-growing instances of cell-based and recombinant vaccines out there to battle the mutation issue. To leave these out makes this secondary claim weaker. She also doesn't include any statistical evidence that helps show the amount of mutation that goes on in these strains. Without it, this argument doesn't have the grounds needed to convince people of the significance of the claim. In response to her secondary claim 2, which was the vaccine contains harmful substances, she shows the CDC reports some of the common substances found in vaccines are aluminum, formaldehyde, MSG, and mercury-containing preservatives. The issue with this secondary claim is that the way she explains it, it has no link to support the proposition. Just because the vaccine may contain harmful substances doesn't mean it's less effective at preventing the flu. Therefore, with her evidence and reasoning, there's no reason this claim should be included in the argument. In response to the secondary claim 3, that repetitive vaccinations result in more ineffective vaccines, she quotes Dr. Bologna and other students or other scientists reported that children who have been vaccinated annually over a number of years were more likely to contract the flu than kids who were only vaccinated in the season in which they were studied. Goes on to say that the vaccine was significantly more effective if they had not been vaccinated in the previous 5 years. The issue with this secondary claim is that there isn't a lot of research done up to this point in detail to help either side of the issue. The CDC states in an article for flu vaccine effectiveness, saying some studies do suggest that flu vaccine effectiveness may be higher in people receiving flu vaccine for the first time compared to people who have been vaccinated more than once. Other studies have shown that they found no evidence that repeat vaccination results in a person being less protected by the flu. They go on to say that the immune responses to vaccination may be higher among people who are not vaccinated the previous year, but repeatedly vaccinated people, i.e. people who receive the vaccine every year, may still have an increased immune response after vaccination. They say the 2 reviews of multiple studies have found that for people vaccinated in the prior season, vaccinating the subsequent season provides additional protection against the flu. Therefore, this claim doesn't have strong grounds to conclude the repetitive vaccinations negatively affects the flu vaccine's ability to prevent the flu. In conclusion, with her proposition that the flu vaccine fails to effectively prevent the flu, she is on shaky ground. Her secondary claim that the virus can mutate is questionable because her evidence is based on only one of 3 ways to produce the vaccine and only focuses on 69% of the vaccine concentration. This makes her claim a hasty generalization due to not evaluating all variables. Her secondary claim that it doesn't support her proposition, so it doesn't belong in the argument. Her third secondary claim is based on information that hasn't been studied in detail yet, and therefore the grounds for the argument is weak. All these combined should help you see that her proposition has little concrete proof to support it. Thank you.
All right, structurally everything is pretty easy to follow. On the first point, you kind of summarize what her argument is clearly. You've got an interesting piece of statistical information suggesting that nearly a third of the strains that we're talking about are kind of outside the purview of the issue that the advocate is talking about. That's a legitimate press, I think, although I think that if we continue the discussion, her position would probably be that we're only talking about the vaccines that are given for this particular strain that we're dealing with. I don't know how we judge validity outside of that particular strain. This is a place where there may be a valid argument that you're presenting here, but it's a little hard to follow in an oral presentation. So it's more complicated. I like the second part of the argument a little bit more, even though it doesn't have the same statistical information, which suggests that there are other ways that these vaccines are produced, and only weaknesses that the advocate's talking about when we talk about mutations and strains are only talks about the egg-based vaccines. I'm going, okay, well that's a pretty good thing, but we don't know. I mean, you kind of acknowledge that egg-based is still the main one. I think this would be one of those places where some projection in the future, some information that talks about how the cell-based or the recombinant DNA-based vaccines are the wave of the future. They are going to be more typical in the future. They're going to reduce costs, and as a result, they're less likely to have the problems that the advocate is citing there. I think you need to get some affirmative evidence on that for your position there. Otherwise, it's a good press, but I don't know that it's particularly convincing. And the notion that the variance in the strains is not addressed by any of the efforts that have been made, that's one of those things that I think is kind of important to see in this argument. What percentage of people who get the vaccines end up getting the flu versus what percentage of people who don't get the flu? That would be the most obvious measurement that you could use. Now, I don't remember that the advocate had any information on that, and I think there's probably good information to suggest that taking the flu vaccine does have this impact. On the third point, for instance, you actually have a piece of information that says that some studies suggest that there is still an additional amount of protection from getting extra flu shots. I think that that's probably a good, important piece of evidence. It would be best if that information was cited a little bit more effectively. That's one of the problems that I had with most of the argument on the third point. We'll get to that in just a second. On your analysis on the second point, I think that you have a very valid issue here. Whether or not there are harmful components there has nothing to do with the effectiveness of the vaccine. That's a separate issue. And unless you could show that any of these ingredients that the advocate mentions inhibit the effectiveness of preventing the flu, then it doesn't really apply to that particular point. I think that that's a very solid analysis of the second point. And then on the issue of decreasing effectiveness, the advocate cited some children's studies. You kind of vaguely cite some other studies that show that there may in fact be a relationship. There is an additional benefit. Like I said, your source, basically your quote is some studies. I'm going, well, what studies are those? Are they the same studies that the advocate used? Are they different studies? Why should I believe one study over another? You just kind of seem to be making a generic expression of what research shows without necessarily making an argument here. And I think it wouldn't be that difficult to demonstrate. The advocate's position seems to be taking the flu shot has no particular benefit, and I'm just going, well, doesn't the CDC recommend this? Aren't there a whole bunch of people who suggest that this makes a difference? Isn't there some quantification about how much fewer flu that we have? It's true that there are variants that we don't get, but does that mean that there is no efficacy for the variants that the flu shot does work for? That seems to me like the kind of information that would just be easy to find, punch that up and say, and now the contrast is, they say some people don't get a benefit, but we do know lots of people do get a benefit. That's the easiest way to make a comparison. Okay, thank you.